behind the velvet at Violetta. I build instruments that ask people to tell the truth. Wood is honest if you listen long enough. Maple answers light with light. Spruce answers pressure with a breath. My days start before the city has the courage to be loud, with a kettle singing on the bench and a blade I sharpen until it splits a hair. I plane ribs to the thinness of a secret, bend them over a hot iron that smells faintly of caramel, and coax them into curves that teach air how to move. If I do my job right, a note floats and your chest knows it's right before your mind does. My wife, Maya, says the shop makes me smell like forests after rain. She used to come by after her agency meetings, heels in hand, lipstick kissed away by coffee, head on my shoulder while the glue cooled. I would shush the radio, and we'd watch the light slide across the varnish of a violin like a cat crossing a windowsill. Lately, the light keeps crossing, and Maya doesn't. It started as an aftertaste. She'd come home late with a new perfume braided into her hair and underneath it a cologne I didn't recognize, something expensive that pretended to be cedar and failed. Her texts thinned out into emojis. Running over, she'd write and then not. A woman in PR always knows exactly what to say. Silence is a decision, not an accident. I pretended not to know that. I picked up a billet of European spruce, knocked it with my knuckle and listened to the ring. A clean, patient note, the kind that promises a violin with a spine. I decided this one would be named Eva. Some instruments tell you their names by how they refuse to be called anything else. The charge on our joint card arrived like a door opening onto a stairwell you don't remember installing. Violetta, XX, XX. It wasn't a restaurant. It was a bar behind a bookstore on the lower end of the old quarter, a place that hid a velvet curtain behind a shelf of battered paperbacks. You pulled out a copy of The Master and Margarita, and the shelf pivoted just enough to let you slip through, if someone on the other side decided you should. I know because I went. I set Eva's top plate to the side, hung a sign that said back in 15, and lied to my work. A barman with a mustache like a soft-serve swirl gave me a look that measured me in ounces. Invitation. "I'm here to listen," I said. He smiled because all men trying to be doors love a password. He slid the curtain for me, and Violetta exhaled cherry smoke and secrets. The ceiling was cracked mirrors, and the music was a trumpet in a low room, the kind of sound that gets under your shirt. Maya was a silhouette in a booth lit from below. The man across from her had a blazer cut to make his shoulders a promise. I knew him, in the way you know a billboard you drive past every day. Casper Board, developer, the sort of man who puts a coffee shop in a former foundry and says he's saving the neighborhood. He was laughing, his mouth too close to Maya's wrist, and her smile had slipped its polite leash. When she lifted her hand to push hair behind her ear, I saw the bracelet I'd given her last year. I'd had it made of silver and a strip of a rejected fingerboard, ebony polished to a mirror. She only wore it when she wanted to feel unbreakable. It looked better under the bar's lights than I imagined in our kitchen. I didn't make a scene. I watched long enough to hate the trumpet for obeying the room, then left through the curtain that pretended it protected anyone. Outside, the bookstore's real customers raised their eyes as the door let me back into the aisle. They smelled paper and didn't know it was a disguise. On my bench, Eva waited with the patience of things that will outlast your pride. I set the soundpost with a tap that felt like prayer. The spruce answered, as if to say, "You'll need to hold a note when you can't hold your voice." 2 days later, a woman walked into the shop with a cello case built like a coffin. She was tall the way a room is tall, without trying. The case was scarred with airport stickers. She wore a black coat too soft to be new, and her hair, pinned loosely, was losing the fight on purpose. She set the case on the floor with reverence and held out her hand. I'm Elena. I was told you don't make instruments sing. You ask them politely and they want to. I'm Julian, I said. I tell them a joke first. Her smile was a small, private light. This one hasn't laughed in months. We opened the case. The cello had a belly a shade of honey that someone had darkened with a clumsy hand years ago. The varnish had all the humility of a woman who'd been lied to. The fingerboard was worn like a path to a house that sold bread warm. What's wrong with her? I asked. Besides a heart broken by flights and being asked to be louder than she is. Elena lifted her bow by the frog, turned it in her fingers. She doesn't answer me when I need her most. She drops away. I don't even get the courtesy of a squeak. We both laughed at that. We traded diagnoses and murmurs, the way doctors talk to spare patients from hearing the names of their illnesses. When she drew the bow across the strings, I stood too close and the note filtered my breath. Leave her, I said. I'll find her voice for you. Elena's hand lingered on the cello's shoulder. Do you find voices for people too? It was a joke that wasn't one. We both knew it. I didn't answer because names taste different if you let them sit on your tongue too long. She came back 2 days later with coffees I didn't need and questions I wanted. She told me she played with a chamber trio that moved like a flock of birds. She called them her muscle memory and her competition. She had an apartment above the florist on Dauphine, with a balcony where pigeons failed at seduction every morning. She was in love with Ravel and, unfortunately, used to be in love with Caspar Board, who she referred to as the man who replaces skylights and thinks that's a personality. They had a year of off and on, ending with a ring she returned on a plate from a restaurant that mistook foam for sauce. She said his eyes were always a little too sure of where they were going next. I didn't tell her what I'd seen at Violetta. I told her about Eva instead, and how there is a point in carving a plate where if you remove one shaving too many you can never get warmth back. You're married, Elena said, not a question. Yes. She watched her coffee cool as if that were her business here. Is your wife kind to you? She used to be. I realized I'd said used to out loud because Elena's eyes softened. It was a softening that wasn't pity. It was shared data, a string tuned to the same pitch across a room. The cello's voice returned under my hands like blood to a numb limb. I adjusted the bridge and the post, cleaned the string grooves, French polished the belly until it blushed. When Elena came for the fitting, she played a phrase of foray that made the room lose its scaffolding. She stopped, surprised at herself, laughed once, then looked up at me with eyes that had words they were not going to say first. My thumb had unknowingly pressed a smudge of polish to my wrist. She reached for my hand and rubbed it away with the seam of her sleeve. The friction was nothing, and it was everything. I held still because the impulse was to move, and we were too close for impulses to be kind. Sorry, she said, a word you say when you mean its opposite. Don't be. My voice came out like I'd been speaking wood all day. That night, Maya slipped into bed with apology sex. There's a rhythm everyone learns and nobody teaches. She put her hand on my chest like a stamp and moved as if to tell me what I should think. I almost let my body believe her because the alternative was new. I turned my face. She kissed my cheek and breathed out a name that wasn't mine. Caspar, she sighed, and then froze so hard the sheets cooled. We lay there, two objects on the same table. She started to say something the size of a country. I got up before we colonized it. I have work, I said. In the shop, the kettle sang an alarm for a fire that had already happened. I set Eva on my lap and stroked her ribs with a rag until my hands remembered anything but the sound of a man's name in my bed. Elena texted. An hour later, a day later, time became that kind of taut elastic. She asked if she could bring wine and pay her bill with bad jokes. I said yes because she would come anyway. She arrived with a bottle in a paper bag and the laugh of a woman determined to be adult about this and failing in the parts that mattered. We drank too much for accuracy, just enough for consent, and leaned on the bench side by side. "Tell me about Violetta," she said finally. "Voice the volume of a secret you're willing to have repeated." So I told her how the curtains sighed when I pushed through, how Maya's wrist, my bracelet, was a lighthouse in a sea of bad lighting, how Casper's mouth was too close to anything it wanted. Elena listened without staging it as theater. She didn't apologize for him. She didn't ask me to perform my pain for her absolution. She put her hand on the bench between us and left it there, a warm, polite stranger. We didn't touch until it was ridiculous not to. I turned and the world went slow in a way that felt like full speed. Her mouth tasted like the wine, then like her. My hands slid up under her coat because they wouldn't wait for permission she was already giving. Drawing a bow across a string is a violence that becomes kindness at the exact right pressure. Kissing is the same. I didn't hurry. I wanted to be good at this in a way that had nothing to do with scorekeeping. She pulled back an inch, forehead against mine, breath earning its place. "Julian," she said, my name a decision and not an accident. "We're not going to be careful, are we?" "I've been careful for years." My hands found the nape of her neck the way you find a harmonic, by memory you didn't know you kept. She laughed and slid me back onto the stool, climbed into my lap with a slowness that made the room a room again. "I have a rule about not making a mess near instruments, and I broke it by existing." She undid one button at a time, and I learned the map of her: shoulder, sternum, the place under the left collarbone where she shivered for music and almost nothing else. When I laid her back on the workbench, the wood was warm from my day. Her hair fell and caught in a curl of maple shavings. I put it behind her ear with the same care I used to set a bridge. The sounds we made weren't polite, they were correct. "I will not be an alibi," she said later, chin on my chest, voice a thread through the silence. "I don't want one," I said. The morning after, Maya and I wore our wedding rings the way some people wear their diplomas, proud in photographs, useless when the work starts. I didn't start a fight. I made pancakes. She ate one bite and left a lipstick print on the rim of her coffee. I washed it off like you rub out a smudge on a varnish and try not to see what's underneath. The gala fell into our calendar like a stone. Casper's company was unveiling a new cultural hub that would keep artists in the neighborhood by renting them their own displacement. Maya asked me to come. "It will look good," she said, and she meant for her. I agreed because sometimes you don't know what you'll say until you hear yourself say it. Elena came as a musician hired to make the hub sound like it had a heart. We didn't plan anything. We didn't need to. I wore a suit that fit and the face that didn't. The building was all glass and a promise, the kind of place where even the air had an NDA. Casper worked the room with his palm pressed lightly to Maya's spine, the proprietary courtesy of a man who thinks every touch is endorsement. When he reached me, he offered a hand. "Julian," he said, warm as money, "I hear you build instruments." "I hear you build places for them to be played," I said. Our palms met. His grip was soft, a powerful man's luxury. He introduced Elena with a smile that tried to say he had invented her. She looked through him like a violin looks through a bad bow. When she played, the glass remembered it had been sand. People turned their heads because her first note told them where to look. It is a crime we don't have laws for, to make a room that candid. In the interval, Maya led me to a balcony where the air didn't require a password. Below, the city kept lying to itself with sirens and neon. She leaned on the railing and built an apology out of words that could be rearranged into any outcome. I let her speak. It is unfair to cut a person free if you don't untie the knots. They'll trip someone else. When she said she had made a mistake and then said it again as if saying it twice changes the physics, I told her I believed her. But we can't keep pretending we like the same song, I said. I can't be background music to anybody else's dance. She had pride and used it. Is there someone? She asked, and when my silence answered, she nodded like a judge with a full docket. There always is. There wasn't, I said, until you left a door open and I realized I was standing at the threshold. We didn't have a scene. We made a plan because you can leave with your dignity even if your heart is in your carry-on. She would stay at her sister. I would keep the apartment with my shop for now. We would call a lawyer whose job is to translate grief into paper. The city breathed around us and didn't care. After the speeches that called displacement curation, Elena found me backstage, fingers still humming. We didn't kiss. Not there. We looked like people in a painting who want to, and the painter knows better than to let them. In the weeks that followed, the shop smelled like spruce and clean decisions. Maya moved her dresses. I boxed our photographs with a politeness that didn't break down under tape. People talk about betrayal like it's an explosion, but for me it was a door. Doors lead somewhere. Elena and I didn't try to be an answer. We tried to be true. Some nights she brought her cello and we played the game where we don't use words. I tuned her, she tuned me. She taught me the small exhalation she made when I traced the inside of her wrist with my mouth, like a sob cut into a smile. I learned to make her forget who taught her to count to 4 and remember only the downbeat of skin. We were not careful, but we were exact. One morning I finished Eva. I signed the label with the good pen, slid it into the belly and glued the top plate. I set the bridge, tuned the strings and drew the bow. The violin answered with a note so clean my throat went tight. Elena closed her eyes and leaned her back against my bench. I played 3 notes and then 4 because sometimes you don't need a song to have music. When I stopped, she was crying in the way the best audiences do it, silently, with gratitude for the private damage. She wiped her cheek, laughed and kissed my jaw. "What will you name her?" she asked. "She already told me," I said. "Violetta." Elena's eyebrows jumped. "After the bar." "After the curtain," I said. "After the moment you decide which side of it you want to live on." That night we went to the bookstore and pulled The Master and Margarita. The shelf moved a fraction, polite as always. We looked at each other and didn't go in. We had a better room. We walked home through a city that could have been anyone's and made it ours by pointing at small things and telling each other what they looked like. In the window of a closed florist, I caught our reflection. A tall woman with a case on her back and a man with varnish under his nails. We looked like a chord you can't play on the piano because it was built for hands that know better than keys. I took her hand and pressed it to my chest the way Maya used to, and this time it wasn't a stamp. It was a prayer that had learned to be answered. Wood is honest. So are bodies when you stop asking them to be furniture. The violin hangs now above the bench, and when the light crosses it in the late afternoons, I can swear it blinks. I like to think it's winking at the city, at me, at the version of myself who was asleep inside the man who polished other people's songs. If you stand very still, you can hear the air moving in its belly, deciding, note by note, what truth it can bear.